There is a silence spreading across the world, a quiet withdrawal of souls who once tried to fit into the noise. You can feel it if you're awake. People who used to speak loudly now speak rarely. Those who once fought for a place in the chaos are now vanishing into stillness. They are not depressed. They are not lost. They are simply awake. And once you awaken, something within you breaks. Not in despair, but in realization. You begin to see the truth, that most of society runs on illusions so loud they drown out the soul's whisper. Carl Jung foresaw this. He wrote that the more you are dominated by the collective, the more your individuality is swallowed up. The spiritually awake are not disappearing because they've given up on life. They're disappearing because they can no longer live inside the imitation of it. They are stepping away from noise to preserve their sanity, their sensitivity, their soul. In a world obsessed with performance, they are choosing presence. In a culture addicted to distraction, they are practicing depth. To awaken spiritually is to see through the collective trance. It is to notice that most conversations revolve around the temporary, status, appearances, opinions, survival. And yet none of these touch the essence of life. The awakened begin to feel foreign among the familiar. They attend gatherings and feel emptiness beneath the laughter. They scroll through the endless feed and sense the hollowness behind the smiles. They hear the world shouting about success, while their spirit whispers about surrender. This dissonance is unbearable once you've tasted truth. Jung said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." That is the world the awakened inhabit, a civilization that glorifies avoidance. We call it productivity, entertainment, even progress, but what it truly is escape, a constant running from the silence that would reveal who we really are. So the ones who can no longer participate begin to retreat. They leave social circles that feel artificial. They stop explaining themselves to those who only hear through ego. They stop engaging in conversations where truth must be diluted to be accepted. It's not that they hate humanity. They love it too deeply to continue enabling its delusion. They withdraw not out of arrogance but out of preservation. Because to stay fully awake in a sleeping world requires energy, sacred, finite energy. And when you pour it into resistance, into endless debates and emotional noise, you eventually realize you're watering desert sand. So the awakened learn silence. They learn stillness. They learn the art of being unseen. This quiet disappearance is not death, it's gestation. They are not leaving life. They are learning how to live differently. They are turning inward, into the temple of solitude, where the real transformation happens. Jung believed that the meeting with oneself is at first the meeting with one's own shadow. And that is precisely what society avoids. That's why the awakened must walk alone, because no crowd will accompany you into your own depths. You go alone, or you never go at all. As they descend into that solitude, they begin to see the truth about noise. It was never communication. It was avoidance. The world doesn't talk to understand. It talks to distract. People fill every moment with sound because silence exposes the emptiness beneath the persona. The awakened, however, no longer fear that emptiness. They meet it like an old friend. They sit in it until the stillness starts to speak. And when it speaks, they listen. Because what the silence reveals cannot be found in books, sermons, or screens. It is revelation that arrives through surrender. There is a sacred exhaustion that comes with awakening. It's not the fatigue of the body, but the soul's weariness from pretending. You reach a point where participating in meaningless conversations feels like betrayal. You can't force yourself to laugh at things that no longer resonate. You can't fake interest in pursuits that feed only the ego. And so you start to vanish, not physically but energetically. You attend less, you speak less, you seek less, because now you see more. Jung warned that the one who awakens before the group often suffers because awareness isolates. You begin to see how much of society runs on archetypes of unconsciousness. The performer, the victim, the judge, the addict, the savior. You used to play those roles too. Now watching others act them out feels like watching an old film of yourself. You feel compassion, not superiority. You no longer want to change people, you want to understand them. But even compassion requires distance, for empathy without boundaries leads to spiritual depletion. So the awakened become invisible. They stop seeking validation because they've learned that truth rarely wins applause. They stop advertising their peace because peace doesn't need an audience. They stop proving, persuading, and performing, and slowly they disappear, not out of defeat, but out of evolution. If you've ever wondered why you no longer fit in, why the things that once entertained you now feel empty, why small talk now feels unbearable, it's because you've started to awaken. The veil has thinned. You've begun to sense the falseness of the game, and once you see the game, you can't unsee it. Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that privilege demands sacrifice, the sacrifice of belonging to illusions. There comes a moment when the noise of society becomes intolerable, not because you're angry at it, but because your frequency has changed. The music that once moved you no longer does. The ambitions that once drove you no longer satisfy. You've begun to crave something purer, something real. So you walk away, not to isolate, but to integrate. You withdraw so that your presence, when it returns, carries truth instead of reaction. This disappearance is not escape. It's pilgrimage. You're leaving the marketplace of masks and walking into the wilderness of the soul. And in that wilderness, you find something the world cannot give you: peace. Not the peace that comes from comfort, but the peace that comes from alignment. The kind of peace that doesn't depend on agreement, applause, or recognition. It's the peace that whispers, you are enough, even unseen. And that's when you realize the disappearance was never about the world rejecting you. It was about your spirit outgrowing it. You are not missing. You are metamorphosing. You are not lost. You are being found in the silence. You are not withdrawing from life. You are returning to it, but this time awake. Comment this phrase below: I'm not gone, I'm awakening. And if this message spoke to your soul, subscribe, because the silence you're entering is not an ending. It's the beginning of something eternal. The reason spiritually awake people are disappearing is not because they reject the world. It's because the world has rejected stillness. Society has grown allergic to silence, to authenticity, to depth. It has replaced reflection with reaction and reverence with consumption. Jung said that people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. That is the essence of our age, a time in which the collective mind has been hijacked by its own creations. Technology, ideology, entertainment, all of them brilliant inventions, but all of them have become idols. The spiritually awake see this clearly, and in that clarity they begin to pull away. They are not running from the world. They are watching it unravel from the inside. They see how the human spirit has been seduced by the surface, how attention, that sacred force, has become a commodity. Every scroll, every click, every outrage is designed to keep you asleep. The game is no longer played with swords and kingdoms, but with attention and belief. And because the awakened have reclaimed both, they no longer serve the system. Their silence is rebellion. Their disappearance is resistance. Carl Jung warned about this collective hypnosis. He wrote that the greatest danger to mankind is the loss of soul. What he meant was not religion, but consciousness, the deep, reflective awareness that connects the individual to the infinite. Without that awareness, humans become programmable. They follow trends instead of truth. They seek stimulation instead of meaning. They live surrounded by noise, mistaking movement for progress. And when a soul begins to wake up within that machinery, it feels like suffocation. Awakening in a society addicted to speed feels like betrayal. Because the awake move differently. They pause before speaking. They choose simplicity over spectacle. They question the narrative everyone else calls normal. They don't rush to post every emotion. They sit with it. They don't chase validation. They seek understanding. And in doing so, they break invisible rules. The rules that say, keep busy, stay distracted, don't think too much, don't feel too deeply. Jung once said, A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them. The awakened have walked through that inferno. They have met their shadows, and in doing so, they've burned the masks that once made them acceptable. Society prefers masks. It finds comfort in conformity. It doesn't know what to do with someone who has met their own darkness and still stands in light. The awakened frighten the collective because they cannot be manipulated by guilt or greed. They don't bow to appearances. They live from the inside out. That's why they seem to disappear, not because they hide, but because the collective can no longer perceive them. When you vibrate at a different frequency, you move in a different rhythm. Your presence no longer fits in places built on pretense. The conversations that once defined you now sound hollow. The ambitions that once thrilled you now feel trivial. You've outgrown the illusion, and the illusion no longer recognizes you. You become invisible to those still asleep, but luminous to those awakening. In psychological terms, Jung would say that the spiritually awake have individuated. They have separated their identity from the collective unconscious. They no longer live from the inherited programs of culture, religion, or tribe. They think, feel, and live from their own center, from what Jung called the self, the divine core of consciousness. And because the collective is threatened by individuality, society subconsciously pushes these people to the margins. The world doesn't exile the awakened. It simply doesn't see them. The quiet disappearance of the spiritually awake is also an act of mercy. They withdraw to heal the noise they once helped create. They retreat not as deserters, but as guardians of equilibrium. The deeper they go into solitude, the more they begin to sense a collective wound beneath all of civilization, a spiritual illness that Jung described as loss of meaning. Modern humanity has achieved everything and yet understands nothing. It has conquered the world, but forgotten the soul. The awakened see this not with judgment, but with sorrow. And so they disappear to keep their light unpolluted, to protect their perception from corrosion. They are not escaping. They are recalibrating. In silence, they rebuild their inner architecture. They listen to their intuition like monks decoding divine frequencies. They become protectors of what Jung called the inner world, that sacred space where God and psyche meet. They disappear into that interior temple, not to abandon humanity, but to reconnect with the source that can heal it. Their absence is their offering. Their stillness is their protest. Their solitude is their medicine. In solitude, the awakened rediscover ancient truths buried beneath the noise of progress. They begin to remember that joy does not come from acquisition, but from alignment. That peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding. That love is not performance, but perception, the ability to see God in all things. Jung believed that every person carries an inner divine image, what he called the imago Dei. To awaken is to see that image, both in oneself and in others. But to truly see it, you must leave behind the fog of the collective, the endless chatter that drowns divine dialogue. This is why the world feels emptier when you wake up. It's not that beauty has vanished. It's that you've begun to perceive how much of what surrounds you is artificial. You start craving authenticity like air. You seek conversations that carry depth, people who speak from spirit, experiences that feel real. But those are rare in a world built on simulation. And so the awakened drift, not in despair, but in discernment. They wait for what matches their truth. They stop chasing. They start attracting. There's a strange grace in this disappearance. You learn to enjoy your own company. You find God in ordinary things, in morning light, in the wind, in a single breath of awareness. You no longer crave to be seen because you've realized that existence itself sees you. You no longer beg for love because you've found the source from which all love flows. You no longer try to fix others because you've discovered that the only healing that truly matters begins within. And then, almost paradoxically, as you disappear from society, you begin to reappear in reality. Not the artificial one made of trends and opinions, but the real one, the timeless dimension that hums beneath all form. You start to live in rhythm with the unseen. You become invisible to noise and visible to truth. The awakened do not vanish. They ascend into deeper layers of being. Jung understood that such individuals are essential for the survival of civilization. He wrote that the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul. The quiet disappearance of the awakened is not the end of society. It is its hope. Because when these souls return from solitude, they bring clarity. When they speak again, their words carry the weight of light. They re-enter not to convert, but to anchor. They don't shout. They radiate. They don't demand attention. They attract transformation. If you've felt yourself fading from places that once defined you, if you've lost interest in the endless arguments and the noise of performance, don't mistake that for depression. It's evolution. The world you're leaving is not reality. It's illusion. You are disappearing from what is false so that you can reappear in what is true. One day, the silence you've entered will speak through you. The peace you've cultivated will stabilize the chaos of others. The love you've remembered will remind the world of what it forgot. You are not disappearing because you're weak. You're disappearing because you're remembering how to be whole. Comment this phrase below. I am not fading. I'm transforming. And if this message echoed your awakening, subscribe, because silence is not absence. It's preparation for revelation. At some point, every spiritually awake person realizes that their silence is not withdrawal. It's communication with something far greater. The world calls it isolation, but the soul knows it as initiation. The disappearance of the awakened is not a vanishing act. It's a sacred summons. When you step back from society, when you no longer participate in the noise that once defined you, what's really happening is a recalibration of the divine within. It's as if life itself is saying, come away for a while. I have something to show you. Carl Jung understood this sacred movement of the soul. He believed that every genuine transformation begins with descent. A descent into solitude, into darkness, into the silence beneath all sound. Jung said, no tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. This descent is not punishment, it is preparation. The awakened are disappearing because they've been called to root deeper, to sink beneath the surface chaos of civilization and reconnect with the soil of the spirit. In the stillness, they begin to perceive what the collective cannot, that society's sickness is not material, but metaphysical. The world believes it suffers from poverty, division, violence, and greed. But these are symptoms, not causes. The true illness is the fragmentation of the soul. Modern humanity has been severed from its inner life. We've built skyscrapers but forgotten how to pray. We've invented machines that think, but neglected hearts that feel. We have infinite information and almost no wisdom. The spiritually awake can see this clearly, and that clarity hurts. It cuts through illusion like light through smoke. When Jung wrote about the self, he described it as the organizing principle of the psyche, the divine intelligence within every individual that seeks wholeness. To ignore that self is to live as a shadow of your potential. To listen to it is to awaken. But when you awaken to it, you begin to feel the dissonance between the divine order within and the artificial chaos without. That's when the calling begins, the inward pull to leave the noise behind and rebuild life from the inside out. This calling is not comfortable. It breaks you away from everything that once made sense. You lose interest in conversations that revolve around opinions. You feel detached from people who define themselves by titles. You find yourself unable to participate in gossip, in competition, in the mindless repetition of empty rituals. You crave truth, even when it's inconvenient. You crave depth, even when it isolates you. You crave simplicity, even when the world calls it laziness. The more you follow that craving, the more invisible you become to those who still live in the trance. Jung would call this the night sea journey, the stage of spiritual evolution, when the conscious mind dissolves so the deeper self can emerge. It's the point where external validation loses all meaning, and inner authenticity becomes the only compass. You start to realize that the world's pace is not life's rhythm. You begin to slow down, to breathe differently, to listen. And in that listening, something divine begins to whisper, you don't need to keep up. You need to wake up. In that awakening, your perception changes. You begin to see through the world's illusions with startling clarity. You notice how people wear exhaustion as a badge of honor, how society worships productivity but fears presence, how entertainment has replaced reflection, and how digital connection has devoured real intimacy. You realize that much of what we call progress is simply distraction dressed in sophistication. And the more clearly you see it, the less you can participate in it. Not out of disdain, but out of truth. The awakened retreat because they understand something fundamental. You cannot heal a system while being addicted to it. True healing requires separation. It requires space for silence to do its work. Jung once said, "Solitude is for me a fount of healing which makes my life worth living." This solitude is not the loneliness of the ego, but the communion of the soul with God. In it, the awakened remember what the world has forgotten, that the inner world creates the outer one. If the inner world is fractured, no law, no technology, no revolution can bring peace. In silence, the spiritually awake begin to rebuild the inner world that the collective abandoned. They replant the garden of the heart, restoring order where chaos once ruled. They begin to live by invisible laws: gratitude, patience, humility, love. These laws are not enforced by governments. They are woven into the structure of the universe. The awakened learn to cooperate with them. They stop fighting life and begin to flow with it. They stop trying to control outcomes and start aligning with divine timing. This alignment is the real reason they disappear. Because once you align with truth, you no longer resonate with falsehood. You no longer need the noise, the competition, the endless proving. You live from a deeper current, the current of being rather than becoming. Jung understood that this shift is what the modern soul resists most. We have been conditioned to believe that meaning lies in motion, but meaning lies in awareness. The spiritually awake know this, and so they step back. They rest not as escape, but as obedience to the divine order. In that rest, revelations begin to surface. You start seeing connections where others see coincidence. You sense patterns that run beneath human history, cycles of creation, destruction, and rebirth. You begin to see how everything that falls apart in society is not an ending, but a clearing for renewal. Jung believed that collective transformation can only happen when enough individuals have faced their own unconscious. That is why the disappearance of the awakened is not a tragedy, it's preparation. They are entering solitude so that in time they can return as healers. The world doesn't need louder voices, it needs clearer ones. It doesn't need more leaders, it needs more souls anchored in truth. The awakened disappear to become those anchors. They are learning how to live without dependence on illusion, how to breathe peace into turbulence, how to carry light without burning out. When they re-emerge, they won't preach. They will simply be. And their being will transform everything it touches. You may not see them on stages, but you'll feel them in the quiet revolutions happening within hearts. You may not read about them in headlines, but you'll notice the subtle shift in human energy, the rise of sincerity, the hunger for authenticity, the return of reverence. These are signs that the awakened are still here, moving invisibly through the collective psyche, planting seeds that will bloom long after the noise fades. Jung once wrote, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you do not know, the world will tell you." The spiritually awake have chosen to stop letting the world define them. They have chosen to find out who they truly are, not through approval, but through communion. Their disappearance is not abandonment. It's a declaration. I refuse to live unconsciously. So if you find yourself drifting away from society, losing interest in noise, longing for something sacred and silent, You are not broken. You are answering the same call that has guided prophets, mystics, and thinkers for centuries. You are being asked to remember. You are being called home, not to a place, but to your own soul. And one day, when your silence has matured into wisdom, you will return, not to rejoin the illusion, but to serve as its mirror. Your presence will remind others that peace is still possible, that truth still lives, that God still breathes through every living thing. That awakening was never about escaping the world, but about loving it so deeply that you could no longer lie to it. Comment this phrase below: my silence is not absence, it is alignment. And if these words spoke to your awakening, subscribe, because the next part will show what happens when the awakened return, carrying divine wisdom into a sleeping world. Eventually, the silence ends, not because the awakened seek attention, but because the time for their return arrives. Everything in the universe moves in cycles: retreat, renewal, return. Even Christ disappeared into the wilderness before he spoke. Even the seed must fall into darkness before it becomes a tree. The spiritually awake vanish from society for a season, not forever. They disappear to learn the language of the divine, to remember how truth sounds before it's filtered through the noise of men. And when they return, their words are no longer opinions. They are echoes of eternity. Carl Jung called this phase the integration of the self, the moment when the individual who has walked through shadow, silence, and solitude emerges not as a fragment, but as a whole. The ego is no longer the master. It has become the servant of something infinite. And when the infinite moves through a human being, everything changes. The awakened no longer react, they respond. They no longer strive, they align. They no longer argue, they embody. Their presence becomes a bridge between heaven and earth. When the awakened return, they bring with them a new kind of light, not the fragile brightness of positivity, but the steady glow of awareness. This light doesn't blind, it reveals. It shows others that peace was never outside, that salvation was never in systems, and that healing was always an inside job. They don't need pulpits or stages. Their life itself becomes the sermon. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." These returning souls have done exactly that. They have faced their darkness and turned it into wisdom, but their return is not a spectacle. It's subtle, almost invisible. They come back into the world quietly, into families, workplaces, communities, carrying something rare: calm. They walk among the restless as reminders of stillness. They move through chaos without being consumed by it. Their mere presence lowers the temperature of conflict, dissolves tension, awakens conscience. They are the healers the world didn't know it needed. And yet, they make no claim of being healers. They understand that the divine works best through those who don't try to own it. Jung believed that every age suffers from what he called the spiritual problem of modern man. He saw that as humanity gained knowledge, it lost wisdom. As it mastered matter, it neglected spirit. The awakened return as the antidote to that imbalance. They are not philosophers or prophets in the old sense. They are mirrors, living embodiments of integrated consciousness. Their message is not new. It is eternal. Remember who you are, beyond the name, beyond the mask, beyond the noise. Remember that you are not just living in the world is living through you. The spiritually awake no longer seek to change others by force, because they understand a higher law. What is healed within one soul radiates to all. They know that the only revolution that lasts is the one that begins in the unseen. They realize that peace preached is fragile, but peace lived is contagious. So they choose to live it, to be it. They plant peace in small, unnoticed places, in the way they speak, the way they listen, the way they forgive. And this quiet revolution grows, invisible but unstoppable, until it shapes the collective psyche from within. You might meet one of these souls and not recognize them immediately. They don't advertise their awakening. There's no performance left in them. They smile differently, slower, deeper, as if they see something beyond your face. Their eyes hold both pain and peace, shadow and light, death and resurrection. They have been through fire and have become flame. They no longer fear endings because they've seen the other side of them. They no longer cling because they understand that everything is borrowed, even breath. Jung said, "The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch without doing anything." The awakened no longer watch. Their disappearance was not passivity, it was preparation. Now they act, but not from ego. They act from alignment. They are the quiet builders of the new world, not the digital one of endless consumption, but the spiritual one of conscious creation. They are the ones restoring balance through simplicity, healing through presence, teaching through example. They don't need to announce the new age. They are living proof that it has already begun. And this is the paradox. While they once disappeared from society, they are now reappearing everywhere, though few recognize them. They are the writer whose words feel like prayer, the teacher whose calm steadies a classroom, the stranger whose kindness shifts your day, the friend whose silence feels like understanding. The awakened have stopped trying to save the world and have started to sanctify it. They understand that the divine is not a distant realm. It is hidden in the ordinary, waiting to be noticed. Their task now is not to escape reality, but to redeem it. They bring consciousness back into matter, spirit back into body, God back into life. They show that spirituality is not an escape from existence, but the art of existing fully. And in doing so, they fulfill what Jung saw as the soul's purpose, to bring the unconscious into consciousness, to make the divine visible in human form. But make no mistake, their quiet presence is a revolution. While the world still glorifies noise, these souls are teaching the power of stillness. While society still worships speed, they are embodying the rhythm of eternity. While culture still chases distraction, they are showing the way home, not to another world, but to the depth of this one. They are proving that awakening is not leaving life. It is finally living it. The truth is, the spiritually awake were never truly gone. They were beneath the surface, listening for God in the static, healing their shadows so they could hold the light without shattering. They disappeared so they could return whole. Their silence was their cocoon. Their reemergence is the resurrection. And now, as they walk among us again, their presence is the prophecy. They remind us that we don't need to destroy the world to save it. We need to awaken within it. Because when one soul becomes conscious, the entire field begins to shift. When one person chooses truth over comfort, the collective mind begins to stir. When one heart remembers God, the world remembers itself. This is why spiritually awake people are disappearing, so they can come back reborn. So they can teach us, not through sermons, but through serenity. So they can show us that salvation was never about leaving the world, but about lighting it from within. Jung believed that the next evolution of humanity would not be technological. It would be psychological, spiritual, and individual. And that evolution begins with the quiet ones, the ones who chose silence over shouting, the ones who disappeared so they could listen. And now, as they return, their message is simple: wake up. Not in fear, not in anger, but in reverence. Wake up to the miracle of being. Wake up to the mystery in everything. Wake up to the divine within yourself. Because the time for sleeping is over, and the new dawn doesn't come through chaos. It comes through consciousness. Comment this phrase below: I have not disappeared. I have awakened. And if these words touched your spirit, subscribe, because awakening is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of everything that's real.